Good evening. If you'll go ahead and open up your Bibles to the book of Daniel, that's where we'll be tonight, the book of Daniel. As you do that, we'll just go ahead and introduce the sermon. We're going to be doing the same series we've been doing what seems like forever. My wife did tell me she's finally getting tired of the series, so we'll have to end it pretty soon. Not because of the lessons in the series, but how many times can you look at the same picture and still like it? So we're going to be, we don't have very many more lessons in this series, and we've talked about a lot of different ideas through the course of the series about how to become better decision makers. What are the benefits of being a more spiritually minded decision maker and keeping the right things in front of your eyes as you make decisions? Tonight we're going to talk about how to make decision making easy. And the Bible really does make decision making as a whole a pretty easy process. And you see that in the life of Daniel. You see that in the way that he and his friends made decisions. So we're going to spend most of our time talking about the stories, the first 6 chapters or so of the book of Daniel. I won't spend a lot of time telling the stories because I think most of us are familiar with them. If you're not familiar with the stories of the book of Daniel, they're all found essentially in these 6 chapters, Daniel's 1 through 6. And so I would encourage you to go back and read those, and you'll see exactly what we're going to talk about tonight as we think about being a decision maker. Before we get there, there's this, I think, a very interesting passage over in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah would have been a contemporary of Daniel. He would have written about the same time as Daniel because he talked about what it means to, or what was going to happen as they went into captivity, and Daniel was one of the Israelites taken captive. And so you get this, Isaiah would have preceded Daniel slightly. But Isaiah makes this statement in Isaiah chapter 30. It says, "For people will live on Zion and Jerusalem. You will never weep again. He will show you favor at the sound of your outcry. As soon as he hears, he will answer you. The Lord will give you meager bread and water during oppression, but your teacher will not hide any longer. Your eyes will see your teacher, and whenever you turn to the right or to the left, your ears will hear this command behind you. This is the way, walk in it." And this was the theme of camp this past year, that particular phrase there at the end. But this idea that we've got a God or a teacher who is traveling through life with us, and that the image here is that God is going to essentially be behind you every step of the way. And as you go forward through life, your God is behind you, essentially cheering you on. This is the way, walk in it. Don't turn left, don't turn right, stay on the path. This is the way, keep moving forward, take your next step. You've got God as this, essentially a guide and cheerleader. And I love that image. I love that idea that we have a God who is that involved in our lives. A God who is willing to stand behind us and keep us on the path. Now again, he's not corralling us. He doesn't have us tied up and leading us along the way as slaves or as captives in war. He's behind us. He's cheering us on. He is prodding us forward and allowing us to make the decision. We can still go to the right, we can still go to the left, but he's saying, stay here and walk in it. Because we have a God like that, because we have a God who is so personal and so willing to be involved in our every decision, that also means we have a God we can depend on. And that's what you see in the life of Daniel more than anything else, is that he knew that he could walk the pathway, God's way, and that would help make his decisions for him. And so that is really what you see as you go through Daniel chapters 1 through 6. For instance, Daniel chapter 1, you've got the story of these young men that are taken captive, and they are dragged essentially from their homeland, from Jerusalem, all the way to Babylon. And they're in Babylon because they're young, they're attractive, they're smart, they're the educated ones, they're the more of the elite of society from the Israelite. They are being essentially groomed to be the servants in Babylon. And so probably, although the text doesn't say this, they are being essentially assimilated into Babylonian culture, because Babylonian culture tended to not wipe out other nations, they would take over other nations. And so in doing that, they would grab some of the choice people, train them up, make them loyal to Babylon, and then put them back over their own people, so that they could essentially be the Babylon loyalist within a foreign nation. Well, Daniel and his friend decided they weren't going to do this the way everybody else was doing this. These young men are taken from Jerusalem, they're taken from Israel, they are put in the king's house, they are trained and educated, they're given Babylonian names, they're taught the Babylonian language and Babylonian culture, and they are to essentially eat Babylon's food and become Babylonians for all intents and purposes. But Daniel and his friends decide they're not going to do that. They decide, and they do so respectfully. I've always found that interesting. They're not rebellious. They're not sitting around yelling out offenses and being upset about their circumstances. They don't. They go to the head guard and they say, hey, this is what we propose. We would like to not eat the king's food. Instead, give us salad and water. We won't drink the king's wine. We're not going to eat the king's food. We would like permission to try this for 7 days and see if we are in any way diminished in stature, if we're diminished physically, if we're not up to par. And they found that when the king agreed to this, Daniel and his friends ended up being healthier than everybody else. Well, that in and of itself showed that their way worked. But what's interesting about the story is not the outcome of the challenge, it's the faith of the young men. It's that they're willing to put to the test following God and doing things God's way. Truth is, it would have been much easier to just go along. We're not actually told why it is that Daniel and his friends choose this as their challenge issue. We don't know that the food they were eating was not kosher. One of the difficulties with that kind of argument is that even if the food were unclean meat, why not the wine? They could have drank the wine. Maybe it's that their food in Babylon was offered to idols and therefore they didn't want to in any way participate in that, but the text doesn't say that. We have to make assumptions as to why Daniel and his friends didn't want to eat this food. I think it's easy enough just to say they wanted to do things in a way that brought attention to God and not take the easy way. Now, it would have been much easier for them to just go along. Everyone else was. These weren't the only 4 Israelites in the room. But Daniel and his 3 friends decide they're going to make a difference and not take the easy way. Then you get to Daniel chapter 2, and you've got the story of King Nebuchadnezzar having that dream of the gigantic statue that's made of these 5 different materials: head of gold, arms and chest of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. And then you've got this, in the dream, this rock that is essentially cut out of the side of the mountain, rolls down the mountain, hits the statue in the feet, statue crumbles into pieces, the rock grows and fills the whole earth. Nebuchadnezzar wants to know what this dream means, and none of his wise men and interpreters and magicians and all of the people that he has surrounding him in his court are able to give an answer. But when he threatens to kill them all, Daniel decides he's going to essentially, even though he's been blessed already, even though he's been honored because of the challenge in Daniel chapter 1, he decides he's going to put it all at risk and say, hey, I think my God can interpret your dream. And so God does, and Daniel gives a somewhat unpopular interpretation. I don't know if we ever give a lot of of thinking about that, but he says, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold, but everything else in the dream is bad news. It's that your kingdom's going to fall and another kingdom's going to come. And that kingdom's going to fall and another kingdom's going to come. And that kingdom's going to fall and then another kingdom's going to come. And eventually there's going to be this one kingdom that's going to come down and it's going to fill the whole earth. But if you're Nebuchadnezzar, what you're thinking is, you mean that's not my kingdom? My kingdom's supposed to fill the whole earth. We know that Nebuchadnezzar is an arrogant man. We read that later on in chapter 3 and chapter 4. But Daniel gives this interpretation that is probably not a popular interpretation. He chooses God's way, God's truth, over what probably could have been status. He's already been lifted up for success one time, and now he puts it all at risk in order to interpret a dream and save the lives of all of these wise men, both Israelites and pagans and Gentiles. Daniel chooses God's way again. Daniel chapter 3, you have the story of Daniel's three friends. I tend to think that the statue that is built in Daniel chapter 3, because its dimensions seem to be somewhat similar to the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. I tend to think, and notice the big difference though. Remember, Daniel said, Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. But what do we learn about the statue that's built in chapter 3? The whole thing is gold. I tend to think that it is Nebuchadnezzar's response to his dream that no, there's not going to be all these kingdoms. It is my kingdom. I am the whole statue. I will not fail. I will not fall. I think that there's a bit of arrogance going on there. But the rule is, he's built this statue, and when the court musicians start to play their music, that everybody that is within earshot, everybody around is supposed to bow down to this statue. That, personally, I still think represents Nebuchadnezzar and his kingdom. What's going to happen if they don't? Thrown into the fiery furnace, right? And we find that in the story, although Daniel's not mentioned in this part of the story, his three friends are. They are in the crowd. The music starts playing. The statue is up, visible for all to see. And everyone bows down except for Daniel's three friends. They're the only ones who don't. They know that they have to choose God's way and not the only, their way. They're going to choose God's way no matter what threats there are. I love their response to the king and the way that the king gets angry about what they've done. And look with me there, chapter 3, starting in verse 16. Chapter 3, starting in verse 16. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't need to give you an answer to this question. Question being, what God can save you from the power of the fiery furnace? What God can rescue you from me? They said, we don't need to give you an answer to that. Like that, to reword that, but that's a dumb question. Now, that's essentially what they tell the king. A little more respectfully than that, but that's essentially what they said. Keep reading. If the God we serve exists, if he exists, then he can rescue us from the furnace of blazing fire, and he can rescue us from the power of you, the king. So there's the answer to the question. If the God we serve exists, he can rescue. That you want to know who can rescue us? Our God can. But even if he does not rescue us, we want you, the king, to know that we will not serve your gods or worship the gold statue you set up. Now, essentially, they put everything on the line here, don't they? If our God exists, he can rescue us. Which means, if they are rescued, what does that prove? Their God exists. That's the point. That's what's being proven here. And so Daniel's friends say, we're going to do this God's way, who said, don't bow down to golden images or to any of these false gods. Don't bow down to anything other than him. I am God, worship me only. That's the perspective of those who are pursuing God's way. And so they cannot bow down to this statue. No matter what the threats are, no matter what the risk is, they are going to do what is right. And of course, we see God blesses them. God sends a fourth person down to be with them in the fiery furnace. They are thrown in. They are unharmed. They don't even have the smell of smoke on their clothes when they are pulled out of the fiery furnace, even though the fiery furnace is so hot, it killed the servants who threw them in. It's amazing. They choose to walk in God's way, and God blesses them. Daniel chapter 4, Daniel chooses God's way over confrontation. This is another one of those chances where Daniel has to come and essentially interpret a dream. This chapter is one of the most interesting chapters in the whole book because it's written by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar tells the story of this dream. He tells the story of Daniel interpreting the dream, and Daniel coming in and delivering very bad news. This is what the dream means. You are going to fall. If your arrogance continues, God will humble you. And I love it when you sit there and you read the way Daniel says it. He says it so tactfully, so kindly. He's so respectful in the way he talks to the king. It seems as if there's even some sort of friendship or relationship there between Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel. But Daniel still stands with God and delivers God's message as God gives it to him. He has to deal with confrontation. But going God's way was more important than any sort of risk of confrontation. Daniel chapter 5, you've got Belshazzar. He is, going back in secular records, not even really king. He's a co-regent with the king that comes after Nebuchadnezzar, but he is one of the kings after Nebuchadnezzar, and he is essentially a nobody. He's the son of a king who is acting as king because, from what we know from secular record, the king himself is away at war. So here he is, king, acting as king, and he is upset because some weird thing has happened while he's having some drunken feast where a disembodied hand shows up and writes a message on the wall of the feast room. And the message is essentially, your time is up. The kingdom is going to fall. But he can't find anybody to give him the interpretation of the message. The message is really a list of mathematic terms, by the way, and economic terms. And you have the interpretation there in Daniel chapter 5 of you haven't measured up, you've been weighed and found wanting, and all of this is about to be over. And Daniel could have stayed silent. Could have. Belshazzar didn't even know who Daniel was. The only reason he finds out about Daniel is because Belshazzar's mom says, oh, there was this guy who used to do these dreams, interpretations and such for God. He was always right. Let's call him in. But Daniel owed nothing to Belshazzar. Nothing. Yet he still delivers God's message. It's interesting. Belshazzar promises all of these promotional things. And Daniel's like, yeah, I don't need those. None of those matter to me. They wouldn't have mattered. They would only lasted a few hours because the kingdom was going to fall that very night. But then we get to the story in Daniel chapter 6, where Daniel again has a relationship with the king, King Darius of the Medes and Persians. And that now, because of some clever working of some of the other governors of the region, Daniel finds himself in trouble. He's been commanded that you cannot pray to any god, you can only pray to the king for a period of time. And Daniel, that's not okay. He's going to pray to his God 3 times a day as he has done for years. And that's not going to stop because some king passed a law. Well, he does. The law passes. He goes to his room. He opens his window, as he has always done, toward Jerusalem, because that was the law when they were in captivity. And he prays to his God just as he has done before. He is caught red-handed doing it. He is brought before the king. The king is distressed because the king loves Daniel, but he must follow the law. And so he sends Daniel to the punishment, which was, you were going to be thrown in the lion's den. Now, Daniel could have said, well, God would understand if I just left my windows closed this time. Because God wouldn't want me to put myself at unnecessary risk. That's the kind of thing we argue sometimes. Or, I know I've been praying. If I really add this up, I'm an 80-year-old man. I've been praying 3 times a day for so many years. If you add this up, I've said a lot of prayers. I'm pretty sure God's going to be okay if I miss my prayer time for the next 30 days. He doesn't do any of that. Doesn't justify himself based on circumstances. He doesn't say, well, I'm going to be safe in this way because that would, God will understand. God doesn't care or really want me to put myself at risk or to put my happiness on the line or to put my life at risk. He does things God's way because it's right. Even though it ends up with him thrown in the lion's den and he has to spend the night in a cave with some cuddly animals for a few hours. Not sure how cuddly lions are, because as soon as Daniel is pulled out and the other governors are thrown in because the king realizes what's happening, the other governors don't even hit the floor because the lions catch them in the air and devour them. That's how hungry the lions were. They wouldn't touch Daniel. Because while Daniel did things God's way, even though it put himself at risk, he also knew he had a God who would keep him safe. Just like God had kept his 3 friends safe in the fiery furnace, just like God had kept him safe all these years in captivity, Daniel trusted God. And I love that. All of that kind of gets wrapped up into this way that Daniel tended to make decisions. Daniel chapter 9, we've got this great prayer. After you're done reading Daniel 1 through 6, if you take my advice and go back and do that, read Daniel chapter 9. Daniel chapter 9 is a prayer that Daniel prays on behalf of his people, asking God, hey God, what are you about to do? What are you going to do next? When are you going to bring your people back into their land so that you can keep your promises? But read with me here what he says, how he opens this prayer that he prays. Daniel chapter 9, starting in verse 4. I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed, Lord, the great and awe-inspiring God who keeps his gracious covenant with those who love him and keep his command, we have sinned. We have done wrong. We have acted wickedly, rebelled, and turned away from your commands and ordinances. We have not listened to the servants, your servants, the prophets, who spoke in your name to our kings, leaders, fathers, and all the people of the land. Lord, righteousness belongs to you, but this day public shame belongs to us. The men of Judah, the residents of Jerusalem and all Israel, those who are near and those who are far, and all the countries where you have banished them because of the disloyalty they have shown to you. Lord, public shame belongs to us, our king, our leaders, our fathers, because we have sinned against you. Compassion and forgiveness belong to the Lord our God, though we have rebelled against him, and have not obeyed the Lord our God by following his instructions that he set before us through his servants, the prophets. Notice in this, and this continues on this way, that God is great, we are not. God is wonderful, we have failed. God has been faithful, yet we're the ones who have been disloyal and rebelled and walked away and not listened and not done the things that we're supposed to do. While he acknowledges the greatness of God, he recognizes the error of he and his people. That's the way Daniel lived his life. With an acknowledgement of the greatness of God. Not the greatness of us. Not the justifying of us. Not the, well, God, if you just understood. None of that, well, God, we just this one time. No. God is great. We are not. That's the way Daniel lived. That made all the difference in the way that he made his decisions, because as he had hard decisions to make, he started from the point of God is great, we are not. Therefore, if God says this is the right way, then that's the way I'm going to go, whether it makes sense to me or not. I'm sure that maybe there was an inkling of doubt when he knew, if I pray today with the window open, and I know those governors have it out for me, and the whole reason they passed this law was to trap me, I know they're going to catch me in this, and I know that I'm going to get taken to the king, and I'm going to get thrown into the lion's den, because Darius is a fair king, and he cannot erase the law once it is put into effect. And therefore, I know God wouldn't require this of me this time. He doesn't do that. He recognizes the greatness of God, both in the way God delivers and in the law he delivered. And he's not going to fudge against that. He's not going to push back against God, because God's ways are right and our ways are wrong. There's a really important lesson in that. We have to recognize God's greatness. I love back in chapter 1, verse 8. Back in chapter 1, verse 8, it makes this statement. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. We don't know what it was about it that made it defiling. What we do know is that Daniel determined, he made up his mind, he knew the right thing was not to defile himself. Even though it would have been so much easier to just go along with what everybody else was doing. He's unwilling to do that because God's way is right and his way is not. So he had to do it God's way. Daniel chapter 12, verse 13. Here he's speaking with an angel who's delivering a message from God, a prophetic message about the things that are going to take place over the next couple of 100 years, because that's what Daniel 7 through 12 deal with, is all the prophecies of things that were about to happen. But I love that as this angel, this messenger of God is speaking with Daniel, he says, verse 9, go on your way, Daniel, for the words are secret and sealed up until the end of time. Skip down to verse 13. But as for you, Daniel, go on your way to the end. You will rest, and then you will stand to receive your allotted inheritance at the end of the days. You hear that? He's essentially told by this angel, this messenger of God, because of the way you've lived your life, because you have put God first, because you have walked God's way, just keep on going. Keep going the way you're going, because when you do, when you get to the end, you have an inheritance. You don't read about that a lot in the Old Testament. But Daniel heard it. Daniel heard it. Because Daniel had lived a life that brought him to the end. Ultimately, what you find is Daniel, while we would look at these stories and go, oh, what a horrible, difficult life he led. He had to go against the king's wishes in chapter 1. He had to deliver a horrible message in chapter 2 and chapter 4. His friends got thrown into a fiery furnace. You see him get thrown into a lion's den. All of those decisions he made would have been so difficult Yet I think for Daniel, they were somewhat easy. They were easy because when you really look at the way the Bible talks about walking God's way, you find it's always talked about as an easy path. It's easy for several reasons. One is 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. It says here, "For our momentary light affliction is producing for us an absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory." I love how many descriptors we have there on that end, right? Absolutely incomparable eternal weight of glory. There is absolutely nothing that can even be compared to how awesome it will be to receive the inheritance that Daniel is promised in Daniel 12, verse 13. Nothing compares to it. And nothing is so bad that when compared to it, that bad thing doesn't become nothing. That's how amazing it is. God's way is easy because it is rewarded in the end. And like we talked about this morning, this idea of keeping your eyes on Jesus, awaiting his return, being excited about the fact that we have a God who is going to give us this reunion with Jesus himself, and that we're going to be brought to our inheritance, those who are awaiting his return. Everything else becomes nothing compared to that if we keep our eyes on the reward. God's way is easy because it comes with help. Matthew chapter 11, verse 30, another well-known passage of Scripture. Matthew chapter 11 and verse 30. Verse 28 says, "Come to me, all of you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke and learn from me, because I'm lowly and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." You know, I don't think in any ways what Jesus is saying here is, you people are a bunch of whiners. I've heard that passage presented that way. That when we complain about all the difficult things we do for God, and Jesus is over there going, "Well, that's nothing. My yoke's easy, my burden's light." I don't think that's the point he's making. The point Jesus is making is that his yoke is easy and his burden is light because he's bearing it with us. You know, this idea of take up your cross, I've talked about this before, but most often, although Dallas did show me a picture of a one-person yoke that he has on his phone. Dallas has a picture of everything on his phone, by the way. And it's not even with Google, like it's literally on his phone. But, but typically speaking, yoke were designed to hold animals together, right? And the idea of my yoke is easy is because he's on the other side. I think that's exactly the same image of pick up your cross and follow after me. The idea of we are carrying our cross with Jesus, that he's bearing with us. God's way becomes easy because he's walking with us. Even if those illustrations aren't right, do you remember what we read from Isaiah chapter 30? That our teacher is behind us, keeping us from turning or reminding us not to turn to the right or left, and he's saying, this is the way, walk in it, keep going. He's with us. What's he promised in the Great Commission? Go, baptize, make disciples, teach them all things that I command you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. He's with us. That's the reason God's way is easy, because God walks with us. And he makes sure that we know that. God's way is easy because it's straight. Back a few pages to Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7, verse 13 and 14. Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road broad that leads to destruction, and there are many who go through it. How narrow is the gate and difficult the road that leads to life, and there are few who find it. Now, Let me be honest here. It actually says here the road is difficult. Okay? And I'm up here saying the road is easy. So which is it? Well, if you have to choose between me and the Bible, always choose the Bible. Like, I'll just go ahead and say that. That should just be the general understanding always. But you couple this passage with some of the other passages, like Matthew chapter 11, and what you find is the point is not that it's going to be a difficult walk for those who belong to God. It's that it is going to be a difficult thing to find in a world that is trying to distract you from it. The difficultness of the road is found in our lack of ability to spot it easily. But ultimately, what you find is this road is not a road full of numerous and unlimited choices. It is a road full of limited choices. I think I've talked about this before, but we used to shop at Walmart for groceries. Shopping at Walmart takes forever. Not just because of the people, but because of the amount of choices that are on the shelf. You don't just go, okay, I want ranch dressing. You now have to choose between 30 different types of ranch dressing and 20 different brands of ranch dressing, right? I mean, it is a ridiculous amount of choices. We have, in the last year or so, started shopping at Aldi. You know how many choices for ranch dressing there are at Aldi? It's actually 2. One's in a bottle and one's in a packet. You have to make it for yourself. If they have that. But Sarah's right. Sarah mouthed 1. There's 1. If you want ranch dressing, it does not take you long to get ranch dressing when your only option is one option. Right? What do you think's easier, shopping at Walmart or shopping at Aldi? Takes me an hour and a half to shop at Walmart if I go. Mostly because I'm trying to choose my bag of chips for the week. But it takes me forever. Aldi, you're in and out in 20 minutes. Right? I mean, it doesn't take long at all. It's so much easier because the choices are narrow. Just not a lot of options. We as Christians have most of our options taken off the table. And the world looks at that like it's a negative thing. Oh, y'all are so narrow-minded. Let me reword that. Christians aren't narrow-minded, they're narrow-walking. We're walking down a narrow path, which takes thousands of options off the table for us because we only have so many we can follow and still be following the straight, narrow path through the straight and narrow gate toward God. There's just an ease of life that comes with that. God's way is better, easier, because it's peaceful. Proverbs chapter 3, verse 17. Her ways are pleasant, talking about wisdom from God. Her ways are pleasant, and all her paths peaceful. They're peaceful. There's a lot to be said for peace. There's a lot of comfort that comes with peace. There's an ease of life that comes with peacefulness. And God's way brings peace. Do you realize that? God's way brings peace. Peace in our own heart because we're not troubled and anxious about bad decisions we're making and difficult things that we're doing, and are we going to get caught, and how do we maintain this lie, and those types of things. You get to take all of that off the table. But then there's also the relationships you have among God's people. When we're living correctly, we are at peace with God's people. That's one of the great things about being a part of God's people, is the amount of peace those relationships can bring you. And then no matter what the difficulties of life, dare I repeat the first point on this slide, there is a peace that comes with knowing that in the end, it's all worth it. It's all worth it. God's way is easy because it's clear. One last passage for you, 1 John chapter 1. 1 John chapter 1, starting in verse 5, says, "This is the message we've heard from him, and the message we declare to you. God is light, and there is absolutely no darkness in him. If we say we have fellowship with him, and yet we walk in the darkness, we're lying. We're not practicing the truth. If we walk in the light as he himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Jesus, his son, cleanses us from all sins." So there, again, tying some of these points together, the idea that if we're walking in the light, we have fellowship with God's people. People who walk in the light walk together. And when we walk in the light, when we're living God's way and walking God's path with him behind us, saying this is the way, walk in it, when that's the life we're leading, we're walking in the light and we can see. You know, the description here is that those who don't walk with God walk in darkness. And walking in darkness stinks. My office is next door to our house in what we call the nest, that little above the garage apartment. But to get there, I have to walk essentially all the way down across our driveway and then up some stairs. And I love when we have a nice, well-lit moon because I can see. I don't know if you know this. If anybody's been by our house in recent years, you know stuff is always all over our driveway. I mean, you cannot clean it enough times without there being a scooter there, some sort of bike laying over, ripped sticks all over the place, balls scattered about. I mean, we try not to even drive down to that portion of the driveway because you have to get out of your car and clean it up just to be able to turn your car around. Like, it is a ridiculous mess of outdoor toys. And it is, honestly, when I have to walk from the house to my office at 4:30 in the morning when I get up and it's dark, I have to shuffle my feet. Shuffle. Because I know I'm going to kick something and run into something or trip over something. Something's going to happen because it's dark. But when there's a nice full moon out, I can just zip across. I generally spill my coffee all over myself because I'm walking so fast at that point that things are sloshing around and all that. I mean, it's so much easier. It's easier to get from point A to point B if I can see. Brothers and sisters, life is a lot easier when you can see. The only way for you to see your way through this life is to be walking with the Father. And not only in that case will you have the light emanating from the Father in order to give your light your path down the way, but you have a Father who is behind you saying, this is the way, keep going, you're on the right path. Keep going down this road, it'll lead to the inheritance that I have prepared for you. Doesn't that just sound like a better life? We'll just take the easy path. Now, Daniel did, and it led him into all sorts of difficult decisions, but those difficult decisions became easy. You don't read of him ever hesitating to do the right thing, because the right thing was serving God. And brothers and sisters, I encourage you not to hesitate to do the right thing. Because the right thing is serving God, it's walking in the light, it's making our path easy because we're making the path the one that God has chosen for us. For some of you, that begins with being baptized into Christ, and I want to encourage you to do that. But for others of us, it means straightening life up in some way. It means getting things right. It means confessing sin. It might mean turning, making that personal decision to turn away. It might mean asking for the prayers of